Excellent. So welcome everyone. My name is Chris. I'm the head sommelier for the Sommelier Company, and today we're going to be tasting some wines from our Shareholder Passport. We've got some pretty excellent product here. I chose all of these alongside the team, the Sommelier Company, working with David Soldavini and Melissa Meyer. Wonderful people, best people to work with for the company. And I've ordered them in such a way that it is logical to go from lightest to heaviest theoretically. So once again, for those of you just joining, we'll be starting off with our Pinot Noir, moving to the Coupe Syrah, and then finishing off with the Gerard Mount Veeder Cabernet Sauvignon. So a couple of things to know about me, a little bit of my background and why I'm qualified to do this. I am a certified sommelier based out of Toronto, Ontario. I initially came to Toronto to pursue musical theater performance. As it turns out, it is not a great way to make a living. But along the way, if you work some odd jobs like I did, and I worked in restaurants, I made a lot more money when I sold bottles of wine. So that is the direction my career quickly took. And I have to say, I never regretted it. It is a truly remarkable career to get into. And they never tell you can do this when you're a kid, for obvious reasons. In my tenure as a sommelier in Toronto, I worked in some remarkable restaurants, including for the Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, working directly for the Toronto Raptors and Toronto Maple Leafs. I've also worked at the first North American location of Don Alfonso 1890, a 2 Michelin star restaurant from the Amalfi Coast. And I've also been lucky enough to work at some of the private members clubs in downtown Toronto, such as the Spoke Club. So it's been a very interesting career so far. And ever since COVID, I primarily talk about wine on the internet for people like yourselves. And I got to say, it's pretty fun. I always find that people have a lot of questions for sommeliers, but usually whenever they're asking them, I'm trying to sell them a second, more expensive bottle of wine for their table. So this is a good opportunity where there's no such pressure, and I get to just answer all these questions really candidly. And these sessions always work best when your questions are answered. So in that regard, if anyone does have any questions at any point, I encourage you to interrupt me, because these sessions are for you, and getting everything that you want to know about wine out on the table is a good way to really engage with it. Further to that, if you're feeling a little bit shy, I totally understand. If you want to throw it into the chat window, I will weave it in as organically as possible. Now with that, we're going to talk about our wine. So the first one we're going to start off with is the Pinot Noir from Laticia, the Block Y5, the Clone 667. The first way that I think is the best to approach all of these is to break it down the same way a sommelier does. So we're going to look at it, we're going to smell it, we're going to taste it, and we're going to see what we can pull out of it. Now, for those of you with your cameras off, I do understand we're kind of in like a Zoom world bubble right now. So maybe if you're in your sweatpants or haven't shaved or showered today, totally understand if you want to keep your camera off. But if you've got it on, it does help me with engagement because I can actually see if you've got the wine in front of you, and I won't have to ask you any questions like, what does this taste like? Only for you to say, I'm sorry, it's not open. Whatever you like to do, but it definitely does help me. From the look of it so far, it looks like Julie and Scott are going to be my go-to guinea pigs. I'll be calling you up to the blackboard several times so we can see what you get out of the wines. Oh, and Bob Gilbreth has got some family in tow. So because you can all put your heads together, I'm expecting some remarkable tasting notes from all of you, but I'm sure you're professionals in this. So let's go ahead and look at this wine unromantically, clinically, like a sommelier does, and then we'll find something beautiful in it regardless. So first thing we have to do is look at the wine. This is theoretically the least interesting part of it for me, but still something very necessary. So let's begin. First thing you're going to want to do is take the wine and tilt the glass so it comes just about to the lip, and then put your hand underneath of it, looking through the top to see how much of your hand you can see. Now, the reason we do this is kind of to assess clarity in the wine. The more of our hand we can see, the more we can say it's a clear wine because it likely has thinner skins throwing less color. If you can't see your hand at all, you're probably in the realm of something a little bit thicker skinned, and this immediately knocks out a couple of grapes that it can be or can't be. For instance, if we know that this is a clear wine, we know it can't be thick-skinned grape, so that eliminates Cabernet Sauvignon, Tannat, Malbec, that sort of thing. And if it's a really dark wine, we know it can't be a thin-skinned one, so it can't be Pinot Noir or Garnacha or Tempranillo. In this case, this is actually a touch misleading, but I would still say this is fairly clear. This is a Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir tends to have really thin skin, doesn't throw a lot of color, so normally you would say this is quite clear, but this is just a little bit darker than the average Pinot Noir. And that is because this is clone 667 of the Dijon clones, famously called the Dijon clones because that was the return address on the carrier that these came in when they first got shipped over to the New World. The color on this is a little bit darker because that's what this clone does. Clone 667 produces a slightly darker skin. And because a lot of people associate depth of color with degrees of complexity, that's always a positive thing. It also helps if you're in a warmer climate that's really sunny, because the darker the skins are, the more the grape seed is protected from the UV rays. And that keeps the seed viable and allows for the grape to get more energy up to it to help ripen it further. So great. So once we've looked at it that way, let's turn it back up. And we're going to notice we've got legs forming on the glass now. Now we're going to pop over to my science corner to explore this a little bit. Legs are generally a way of assessing alcohol, but they're not 100% reliable. So let's break that down. To look at this, this is the Marangoni reaction. We have alcohol and water present at the same time inside of wine. When you spread it along the side of the glass, the alcohol evaporates first, leaving behind the water, which pulls itself together, having a higher surface tension. It gets eventually so heavy that it falls down in legs, and theoretically, the more alcohol you have in a wine, the more legs there will be. This is not a perfect science, however, because any residual sugar in the wine can affect the way the legs present themselves. So we have to taste to confirm. But before we taste, we have to smell. So let's go ahead, put our noses in the glass, and we're going to break it down this way. Instead of thinking of a specific fruit right away, we're going to start by thinking of what color of fruit are we smelling. We normally break it into a couple categories with red wine, thinking of red fruit, black fruit, and blue fruit to start off with. So let's start with that. And let's go with Wayne Saxton. Wayne, you've got a lovely glass there, and you've come a little late, so I'm going to pick on you just for a moment, but I promise it's all in good faith. So Wayne, what do you catch on the nose of this wine? Anything stand out for you? Oh, I'm afraid you are muted, Wayne. I'm so sorry about that.
I was saying strawberry or blueberry.
Oh, delightful. I love that. That's actually quite perfect. So that to me says we have a little bit of red fruit and a little bit of blue fruit. Would everybody concur? Hands up on that one? I think so. Absolutely. Well done, everybody. So red fruit and blue fruit, I think that's a perfectly reasonable call. With Pinot Noir, we're generally in the realm of red fruit because it's got thin skins. It normally leans into red fruits like strawberries, cranberries, raspberries, that sort of thing. But I love the call of blueberry too. Being that this is clone 667, you will have a slight darker tone to it, usually not leaning into black fruit, but blue fruit's a really good call. There's also something that I always associate with Pinot Noir that kind of reminds me of blueberries, but isn't quite. Has anyone ever gone berry picking and found like wild blueberry bushes, and the resin on the leaves is a very particular smell? For me as a youth, I got to spend a lot of time in the back 40 and they just grow wild everywhere there. And so for me, the first thing I think about when I get that blueberry note is I smell those leaves. And there is something to that when we talk about Pinot Noir. Now, before we get into that very deeply, let's talk about non-fruit aromatics, because we always have them on wines. It's why sommeliers like myself will talk about, oh, it smells like boot leather and cigar wax or something. Totally not really relatable or realistic, but something that is reminiscent of something. So let's talk about what we get here that's non-fruit. We can break it into a couple categories if you like, but we can also freewheel it. I like to think about, is there vegetal here? Is there herbal character here? Is there wood here? And is there any earth? Is it organic or inorganic? That sort of thing. So let's go to Julie and Scott on this one. Julie and Scott, beautiful glasses you have, wonderful home. What do you guys catch on the nose here that is not fruit related? Anything stand out?
I would say it's more herbal.
Herbal, wonderful.
Of the different choices that you went through there, definitely herbal. It's not very woody, it's not very earthy, but it's herbaceous scent to it.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely correct. By smelling this, I cannot get really a strong sense of vanilla or coconut or spice even. So I would say this is thoroughly not dominated by aging in wood. Sometimes aging in oak barrels can change the wine significantly by throwing a couple chemicals and also the scent of wood and cut wood itself. But this is really fruit driven and also really herbal and herbaceous. Now, there is another note that is always associated with Pinot Noir, and in France it is referred to as sous bois, which I think is a great call. So when we say sous bois, imagine you're in the woods, and for whatever reason, you're rolling over a log, and you smell the earth underneath of it. That's what we're talking about when we think of sous bois, like a wet, damp earth. In North America, there's a wine writer named Karen McNeil who refers to it as smelling like corruption, which is a really interesting idea, kind of a hard one I have selling tableside, so I don't know that I would say it, but I do like what she's getting at, because we're talking about here decomposition. We're talking about like wet, rich soil that smells and has got life to it. We're talking about leaves that have fallen down in the forest after it's rained and you get that beautiful fallen forest floor smell. We're talking about pine needles. We're talking about moss, and all of that I kind of get on wines like this, especially that scent of dark earth, like dark, wet earth. Absolutely beautiful here. So corruption, not a really easy one to sell tableside, but I do like forest floor and mushroom. Also, that usually kind of stands out with Pinot Noir. Both those characters kind of reminiscent of the same thing, but really beautiful ways of expressing this elegant grape. Now, we're about to taste it, so I encourage you to taste it, and I'm going to wax a little bit about Pinot Noir for just a moment. So Pinot Noir is one of the most lauded grapes across the entire world. It's planted almost everywhere because it's a wonderful, cool climate varietal. So anywhere where it's too cold to grow something else, Pinot Noir can usually thrive. It also does really well in warm climates, even though I would say it loses a lot of the nuance that makes it so interesting. But if planted really well and the yield is restricted, you get something quite cool out of it. Now, in Pinot Noir, where this originated was Burgundy. In Burgundy, you had a couple of clusters of Cistercian monks and Benedictine monks, and because they had a lot of time to spend thinking about God and praying, when they were just walking across the road, they might find themselves a little bit bored and idly wonder, why do the grapes on this side of the road grow better than the grapes on this side of the road? And if you ask that question another 2,000 times, then you can eventually see what happened in Burgundy. These monks isolated 4,000 different vineyards and then ranked them by cru, premier cru, and grand cru, selecting certain ones to be held better than others because of certain qualities like elevation or grade or slope, soil composition. All of these things made a big difference. And to this day, Burgundy is so highly divided that each separate vineyard is supposed to have a significant character unto itself. A best example of this that's really easy to approach, and if you've got some Burgundy in your cellar, good way to check it out. In the north of Burgundy, in the Côte de Nuit, we've got Gevrey-Chambertin. It's one of the most northerly villages. It's considered to be creating masculine Pinot Noirs, which is kind of an old-fashioned way of saying they tend to be bold and aggressive. And then just a little bit to the south, you've got Chambord-Musigny, where they often describe it as being elegant and feminine and refined. Again, feminine, I think, is kind of an old-fashioned term for these, but I do like elegant and I do like refined, and you certainly get those elements there. And then to go just a little bit further south, maybe the most legendary village that grows Pinot Noir is Vosne-Romanée, where it's referred to as smelling like a field of 1,000 flowers. So for hundreds of years, literally since the 1300s, this grape has beguiled people all over the world, and I think it still does to this day. It's why it gets so much acclaim and why people really select single vineyard expressions of it to showcase how good it is and how interesting. Now, I hope we've all had a chance to taste it. If you haven't, go ahead and do so. And the first thing that I want to know is, does this wine make your mouth water? If you're trying to figure out exactly what I mean there or need to zero in on that, think about, you've got two salivary glands right underneath your tongue. If you let the wine really roll around and swish through there, you might notice that right under there, it's tingling a little bit and is maybe starting to produce a little more saliva. So what's happening here is your mouth is recognizing you just drank something that is low in pH, which is to say acidic. And so it's recognizing that this acidity could score your teeth. So I'm going to create more saliva to neutralize the pH. And this is important because acidity can tell you where wine is from. So if you get really good at calibrating that acidity, you can actually zero in on where in the world this came from. And that's partially how sommeliers do what we do. So before we go into that, does anyone have any questions so far on what we've just covered? I know it's very easy to get into a lore/info dump here, but I do like to make sure we get all our questions answered. Also, Wayne, wonderful puppy. Probably your ringer for making sure you can get all the best notes out of these, I'm sure, right, Wayne? Absolutely.
I'd say, Chris, that was the best explanation of acidity that I've heard in many years as far as how to sense that. So thank you.
Absolutely. You're not a problem, Scott. That's exactly what I'm here for. So why is acidity so important? Why is it a thing that we hang our hats on? If you think about the life cycle of a grape bunch, when it's on the vine, it starts off as this tight green bunch of grapes. It doesn't have a lot of character, doesn't have a lot of flavor. If you bit into it, you have a bad time. It doesn't taste good, and it's made to be. It's supposed to taste so green because it stops predators from eating it prematurely and ruining the seeds. So as it begins to ripen throughout the season, it changes color and begins to build up acidity. The acidity eventually reaches a critical mass and then begins to create sugar. And then we have the most beautiful chemical formula in existence, which is sugar plus yeast equals heat plus carbon dioxide plus alcohol. Boom! It's chemistry that you can drink. So truly wonderful. and really important to this whole mix, and also for understanding where this came from. So if we know that to be true, then in a really warm climate, we know that we're going to build up a level of acidity, and then it's going to drop dramatically, and we're going to build up a ton of sugar, which tracks. In warm regions, you're always able to ripen grapes a little bit better, so you always have higher alcohol in a warmer region, and usually accompanying that lower acid. But by that token, you also have in cold regions wines that retain a lot of acidity, and therefore tend to be a little bit higher in acid and lower in alcohol. So when we get really good at calibrating acidity on wines like this, we can have a really good idea of where this came from, because we can eliminate 2/3 of the planet. Gradually, we've started to come to an idea of breaking regions down into cool, moderate, and warm climate on either side of the equator. And when you can eliminate 2 of those, because you've already settled on this is from a warm climate, well, then you can really narrow down where this could be from based on what grapes grow where and all the other notes you've associated with this wine to help pull it all together. So this brings us to why we do this. It's all in service of the blind tasting. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Somm or the show Corked, things like that, you see a lot of sommeliers doing blind tastings, coming up with really weird ideas of what things taste like, and overall being kind of pretentious about things to each other, sometimes to the general public. It's terribly unfortunate. But one of the things that they're not explaining here is that blind tasting is not a means, is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. If I am so good at blind tasting that I can tell you where this wine is from, how old it is, and what grape it's made out of just by going through this process, then when I can actually see the bottle, I can tell you if that is a good example of that wine or not. And that is something I would say is arguably more important. When I work in a restaurant, a lot of the ways that I choose wines for the wine list is someone brings in 30, 20 wines to me, and I have to rapid fire taste through them in about half an hour before I have to jump into dinner service and run the floor. So it's really high pressure, and it tends to be very quick. But if you get very good at the blind tasting, you can make good snap decisions on which of the wines that they're showing you are worth purchasing for the tasting. So I'll say something like, okay, well, that one is a little bit too expensive for what it is. That one is a wonderful deal. That one's going to need a little more time, but I'll take it anyway. And by making good choices in the restaurant, I might be keeping it afloat. Most restaurants don't make money off of the ribeye or the tenderloin. They're simply too expensive. The food cost is incredibly high on those. So we rely on things like the alcohol program to make back that money. The alcohol program can usually be marked up 2, 3, even 4, 5 times, though I would suggest don't go to those restaurants that mark them up 5 times. I'm sure you know which ones I mean. They have chains across North America. Doing that, we might be the reason that if we've kept a really good wine list together of why the restaurant stays afloat, and it pays for the hostess at the front door, it pays for the server assistant who cleared your plates, and it pays for the sous chef to make sure the chef in the kitchen does not kill anyone. So all very important, and that is why sommeliers have a job and why I do what I do. So I know that's kind of a lot. So does anyone have any questions on anything we just covered there? Did it open up your eyes on how we do blind tastings and why we do them? Whatever you would like. And I'm going to take a sip of this wine while you think about it. I've got to say, this is a remarkable Pinot Noir. One of the downsides I often find in the North American wine industry is the intention to make a wine that is technically correct. And usually that means that there is no volatile acidity, which means no vinegar that makes it in the fermentation process. It means that there's no Brettanomyces, which is a spoilage yeast that makes its way in if you let the wine ferment at too high a temperature. And all of that's really great, but sometimes the things that make a wine complex and interesting are some of these wine faults. Brettanomyces on its own is something that has a very interesting aroma wheel. It has things like clove and leather and nutmeg on it, but it also has wet hay, manure, barnyard. So depending on how good you are at managing faults like this, it can be a very interesting wine or a total disaster. But in Bordeaux, this happens pretty consistently. It's considered part of the style. And once you get a yeast into a winery anyway, whether it's a spoilage yeast or not, it's pretty hard to get them out. So that character has made its way into a lot of Bordeaux wines, and it keeps them being so interesting today. In North America, we've tried so hard to isolate all these little chemical components, these bacteria, and make sure they can't make their way in. And I think it's actually to our detriment. We lose the ability for happy accidents. And while these things are technically correct, they're not always so interesting. But this, I would say, is a very interesting wine. What we can see here is a wine that is not covered in oak to lose some of the more interesting aromatics of it. What we can see is a Pinot Noir that has elegance and refinement to it. It's not a bold, brashy, jump out of your glass fruit bomb. It's a restrained, ripe fruit, but not overripe fruit expression of Pinot Noir, which is, I think, where it is at its best. And with that, let's talk about Pinot Noir in California very briefly. So does anyone know the movie Sideways? Yep, lots of hands up here. Everyone's heard of it, at least, if they haven't seen it. Well, Sideways is a wonderful movie with Thomas Hayden Church and Paul Giamatti traveling through wine country and learning a lot about themselves on the way. But unfortunately, that's not what most people took from that movie. If you haven't seen it, then most people have seen at least the trailer where Paul Giamatti is screaming that if they're drinking Merlot in there, he's leaving. So basically what they did with that movie is bring the market share of Merlot from 20% in North America down to 6% in 1 quarter after that movie was released. So pretty dramatic problem for that part of the wine industry. And it also gave rise to Pinot Noir. In that movie, it's impossible for Paul Giamatti not to fetishize it, even though I find it to be truly interesting. There are many grapes out there that are quite good. And so because of that, Pinot Noir started to get a little bit more interest in North America. And from there, 2 years later, in 2006, Mayumi was released, which if you've tasted Mayumi, it tends to be, what's a good way to put it that's diplomatic? Very ripe, very, very ripe. So ripe, so overripe. And that's fine. But a lot of people think of Mayumi as kind of like Pinot Noir masquerading as Merlot, and I don't totally disagree. It doesn't have a lot of the character that we're seeing in this Pinot Noir today. It doesn't have a lot of restraint. It doesn't have a lot of acidity even, and it doesn't have a lot of the earthy notes that I would say define a really good Pinot. So unfortunately, that took a lot of the market, and we kind of came to understand Pinot Noir at its height as being that. But there was a group that was created to kind of combat that notion. Shortly after that, a group called In Pursuit of Balance was created. And the intention there was to encourage other winemakers to restrain how much alcohol they have in their final wine. For a long time, people associated higher alcohol with higher quality in wine. And to a degree, that was true in the 1700s, because people would often have wines in cold climates that they were struggling to ripen. And a sign of good years and good ripeness was better alcohol, because we knew that the year gave it enough time to ripen fully and give you that extra 0.5%. But now we know that's not necessary to make something really interesting. There's some beautiful wines around the world that are 12%, 12.5%. So why do we need to over ripen something when we could just restrain it a little bit and keep more interesting character? So In Pursuit of Balance was a group that was formed to do that. And I would say ever since then, Pinot Noir in California and in the New World in general has been pulling back its alcohol and working more towards the restraint that I think we are seeing quite successfully in this Laticia Pinot Noir. So excellent. So
Chris,
yes, please, Scott.
Where exactly is the Arroyo Grande Valley?
The Arroyo Grande Valley in the central coast of California, it tends to be a slightly cooler area because in the valley, you don't get a lot of the hot winds and it blocks out a little bit of the sun on certain aspects. It's also a slightly better slope, so it tends to be a little bit more fertile in that area, but it also drains really well. And that's what makes it such an interesting area. So
central coast, like further south of San Luis Obispo, further south of Paso Robles?
I believe fairly close to Paso Robles. Let me confirm. Excuse me. So sorry about that.
North of Santa Maria, south of San Luis Obispo.
There we are.
Okay. Thank you.
Beautiful. Excellent.
Thank
you so much, Wayne. It's good to have a Google person close to hand there. I will send you any questions I'm unable to field. Great. So does anyone have any further questions about this Pinot Noir?
Yes, it's a relatively young Pinot Noir. What would you say the ageability of this wine is and why?
I would say that the things that make a wine able to age are threefold. You've got a kind of nice tripod, I would say, of legs that go into aging. So you need to have good levels of acidity, the higher the better. You need to have good levels of tannins, and you need to have a good fruit concentration. Now, Pinot Noir generally has relatively low tannins. You'll notice I didn't talk about it with this grape because the structure doesn't highlight it as well as the other two grapes that we're going to see, and I do like to cover it there. But in that regard, I would say that this is a wine with a lot of potential. What we can see when we're smelling it and tasting it, I think is a really dense fruit expression that, while not overripe, still feels like it has a long way to go. And I think that unpacking that over time is going to be really beneficial for this wine. So I would say this wine's got probably 10 years on it minimum. I wouldn't want to venture too high higher than that, because while I do find the acidity quite nice here, I still find it a little bit lower than some of the best cool climate varietals that age for a very long time. And also still the tannins are quite restrained, but the fruit here, the fruit density really does encourage me to believe that this is going to get very interesting over time. So 10 years is where I would put it at. And that is, by the way, a very conservative estimate. In some cases, I found a lot of New World wines don't age as well as we think they will because they tend to be a little bit too high in alcohol. But I think this is one that does stand up quite well. There's actually a really nice story that has to do with Cabernet Sauvignon, but I think we'll get to that when we actually taste a Cabernet Sauvignon alongside it regarding ripeness because, hey, they're relevant. Why not? I also see Wayne has got a wonderful device there. Wayne, would you mind showing that to the crew? Excellent. Does anyone else have that? That is a Coravin. I see, yep, Julie and Scott are reaching for theirs. Wonderful. So for the layman, or for anyone who doesn't know what that is, the Coravin is a needle that goes through the top of the cork and injects argon gas into the wine. Argon gas is non-reactive, which means that it's not going to affect the wine in any way, and it displaces any oxygen that might try to make its way in, effectively preserving it. This needle going through it allows you to puncture and repuncture the cork several times without the wine changing significantly. And in the restaurants that I've worked in, we've used it to great effect to open some relatively rare bottles that we might not otherwise have our hands on. So it's a pretty great opportunity to check that out. It's relatively expensive, but as a wine lover, I think totally worth it and very, very fun to have. Argon canisters are probably the most expensive part of it, because if you drink a lot of wine and use it a lot like I do, they're something like 25 bucks a pop for a little guy like this. And they never go quite as far as you would like them to, unfortunately.
I think right now, Chris, is probably the best time to actually look for a Coravin. With all the Christmas sales, there's about 30% off all the time. And actually,
that's true.
The Coravin argon gas capsules, typically they'll have good sales, and you can get them for about, excuse me, about $3 a piece. You know, get a pack of 6, and they're $3 a piece, so 26.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I apologize. In Canada, I'm being ripped off horrendously. So good to know. I will ask some of my coworkers at VWE to send me a batch, perhaps. That's probably the best way to go.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really good to know. $3, man. Oh gosh, Canada. Oh, Canada. What are we doing up here?
Yeah, but your drugs are cheaper, so.
Drugs are much cheaper. That's the balance. You can see where my priorities are. Great. So with that, let's go to wine number 2 and talk about Syrah. Syrah was the wine that could have been and should have been and still was, but just not the way we thought it was going to be. So we talked about Pinot Noir and its increase in popularity already, but what a lot of people don't know is that when people were trying to figure out what was going to be the grape of the Central Coast and Sonoma Coast, they were thinking about Syrah. It was a very natural thing to go into. When they were looking at what grapes are going to handle Sonoma really well, they started thinking, well, you know, GSM blends. These are grapes that have a little bit of restraint, and they also deal well in warm climates, as we've seen in the Southern Rhone. Things like Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. So we started to have this cadre of people that were referring to themselves as the Rhone Rangers, where they were importing Rhone varietals to produce in their vineyards in California. Maybe the most famous of those is Saint Quanon today, where they make some pretty incredible wines of really high extraction and alcohol out of Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvedre. And while I normally rail against wines that are 16%, one of the things that these wines have going for them is that because they deal really well with warm climates, they don't lose acidity when they over-ripen. So you can still have Grenache and Syrah with relatively high acidity, even at higher levels of alcohol. So always a good balance in that way. Now, because of Pinot Noir and the rise of Sideways and Meumi and things like that, it never really took off, at least not the way people thought it was. Certainly, Pinot Noir is more synonymous with Sonoma at this point than Syrah is, but I think Syrah is becoming a much more logical choice for any growers that are replanting parts of their vineyard. And indeed, when Saint Quanon popped up, it was clear that it had become popular enough to attain cult status. So I think that is probably the future of Sonoma, but we will see. And I think Cupé is a really good example of that. So let's go ahead and smell this one and see what stands out on the nose here that we didn't catch on the previous wine. First off, let's go with Kerry Hovey & Co. You've got a wonderful quorum over there and a great spread, by the way. So what do we think about the nose of this particular Syrah? What stands out to you on this one? Oh, they might be a little occupied. I will leave them to their wines. Let's go with Bob and Steph then. Bob and Steph, what do you guys think about this one?
I feel like it almost smells a little mossy.
I like the idea of mossy. I think that's a really good one. I almost get more wood on this than I do the previous Pinot. But that kind of organic wood that comes from a well-made wine, not organic wood from like an oak barrel or anything. Does anyone get dark fruit on this wine, like blackberries? Yeah, Wayne, wonderful. Does anyone get black olives on this wine?
Yes.
Yes,
Sure.
excellent. I think that's a really great way of expressing this one. It's really, really black olive forward. And that comes from a very particular chemical. I don't know if you guys have noticed yet, but I do love isolating the chemistry in these wines because while it's really fun sometimes for sommeliers to list esoteric characteristics about a wine, I don't know that I truly find them totally useful. I remember a sommelier once told a room that I was in with a straight face that the wine smelled like a cigarette he once had in Marrakesh that was made with spice and tobacco. And I thought that was really great for him, but it said nothing to anyone else in the room. It's not something that anyone else can relate to. Even in the movie Somm, one of the guys refers to the wine smelling like freshly cut garden hose or freshly opened tennis balls, which means I know a lot about how he grew up, probably in a sports warehouse, but I don't know much about the wine if I don't play a lot of tennis, which unfortunately I don't. Too cold up here. So I like to stick with things that are a little bit more universal. And when it requires a little bit more depth, I like to try and isolate the chemical component that makes it smell that way. And in this one, we have a very particular one in Syrah that stands out. So in some other more aromatic grapes like Muscat or in some cases, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Torrontés, those kind of grapes, they all smell very floral. And it's because they have the same chemical in them that makes flowers smell like flowers called terpenes. They're very bright and they exist in the grapes before fermentation. So if you don't believe me, you can actually bite into a Moscato grape and it will still smell really flowery before it even touches a fermentation bin. So from there is a group of chemicals that is related to terpenes called sesquiterpenes or rotundones. Those smell also very strong and very aromatic, but very different. And we're actually experiencing them here. Rotundones often smell like a little bit of dark earth, especially black potting soil. They smell a lot like black olives. They also smell like black pepper. And maybe most famously, I've heard people refer to it as smelling like bacon and cured meats. And I think from smelling this, I would say that's fairly true. There is something here that is reminiscent of a very well-made charcuterie board. And I have to say that black pepper does stand out pretty strongly on the nose of this wine. All these things due to a chemical of rotundones. Rotundones are great because they can really help narrow down what grape we could be dealing with here, because only a couple of them have it in really strong quantities. One of which, of course, is Syrah or Shiraz, but it shows a little bit differently depending on whether or not you're in the Rhone Valley or in California or in Australia for that matter. And that has a lot to do with ripeness levels. Or Mourvedre. Mourvedre is a grape from the south of France that you usually see in the Bandol region or sometimes in the southern Rhone as well, but also a grape that is known for its rotundones and is referred to as smelling a little animal, which is a very general note that is really hard to isolate except to say it smells a little bit like a wet dog. We don't like to besmirch Mourvedre in that way, though it deserves so much better. So we'll just talk about the Syrah instead and its black pepper notes. So excellent. We've got a lot of black pepper here, a lot of black earth, a lot of black olives, everything black. And a really, really strong expression. Now, something that we didn't cover in the first wine that we talked about was what is the condition of the fruit that we're smelling. I think we can pretty generally consensus that this is a black fruit driven wine, but we haven't talked about what is the ripeness level of the black fruit here. If this is blackberry or black raspberry or what have you, does it look like in your head when you picture it, a really underripe version of that berry? Or does it look really overripe and really juiced? Or does it fit just in the middle, like perfectly ripe and not over or under in any way? What do we think about that one? Does anyone would like to weigh in?
I call it an overripe mulberry.
Overripe mulberry. I don't disagree. There is definitely something there to that. I think that you're right. I think this kind of rides the cusp of being ripe to overripe. For me, there's a lot of beautiful ripe notes of blackberry that come through here, but there's definitely something that suggests a little bit extra heat in the region. And I think that's true. This is from Bienesito in the Santa Maria Valley. And what's really beautiful about the Santa Barbara area is that they are a transverse valley. So while they have a lot of heat and they've got a lot of sunlight, they also have the opportunity to get a lot of cool breezes off the ocean directly. If you think about Napa Valley, which generally runs north to south, but well, kind of on an angle, but we'll say north to south, the Santa Barbara Valley runs east to west, which means they get a big pull off the Pacific Ocean that helps cool the grapes in the day and stops them from over ripening. And it also retains acidity by being so cold. So really important aspect that can make a wine be a little bit more three-dimensional than you would expect. Now let's taste the wine again, because it's so delightful, I can't stop drinking it. And think about the tannins here and see if you can detect any. And to be clear, while we're tasting those, I'll just explain what those are. Tannins are monomers and polymers with a negative charge that when you allow them to interact with things like your mouth or each other, they try to resolve that charge by forming a bond. So when you have tannins in your mouth and you have tannins in a wine, they bond to your tongue, and that feeling of dryness comes from these freshly bonded molecules rubbing against each other, creating a grippy sensation. When you get really good at tasting grapes, or you taste a lot of them, you can actually use that tannin to kind of isolate what grape this could be, because certain grapes do have a distinct tannic signature. I would say Cabernet Sauvignon tends to be kind of coarse and chunky. I'd find Merlot to be a little bit more sandy and refined. And Barolo, or wines made of Nebbiolo, actually get a little bit bitter because the tannins are so small, they interact with the smallest taste buds on your palate, the bitterness receptors. So wines like Barolo and Barbaresco can actually be bitter because of the way they grab you. So kind of cool in that way. In this way, I would say there are tannins here, but they are not overpowering by any means. This is very much a fruit-driven wine. And while they do create a dryness on the top of the palate that the last wine just does not do, I do not find them to be aggressive or overpowering or even fully coating my mouth. I'm really getting them mostly on the forward part of the tongue. And so while I can say that there are tannins here, I would refer to them as being more medium than I would anything else. With that, I would also say the acidity is probably closer to medium plus, as it is noticeable, but maybe not quite there. I don't want to say medium because it does a little bit higher than that, but medium plus maybe is more accurate. And then the alcohol has a pretty nice burn, a nice warming sensation. So I would have to give it like medium plus as well. And that tracks because it is a relatively warm climate, no matter how cool the breezes of the Pacific are. So great. So that is wine number 2. We're actually cracking through these quite quickly. So I'd love to take some more questions if anybody has them.
Can I ask a wine history question?
You may.
Alcohol levels in historic wines, you know, if you read about ancient Greece or Rome, they talk about how much they water down the wine.
Mm-hmm.
Was it stronger wine back then, or are they just drinking more of it over a longer period?
So it's two things. It's that it was not necessarily stronger, but because they didn't have great aging vessels, oftentimes it was ceramic vessels, they would evaporate some of the water, and some of the alcohol too, but it would still concentrate some of the flavors. And also because they don't have quite as healthy winemaking practices, you often had a lot of vinegar, you had a lot of Brettanomyces. And so when that gets dried up a little bit, it really concentrates those off aromas. So adding a little bit of water helps to balance it out. Also, there is even a description amongst Greek philosophers of how best to drink wine and how many glasses you should have and how many actually lead you to danger. And they talk about once you get to 8 glasses of wine, you're truly in danger of harming your friend group, which, I mean, you know, 3 glasses of wine, depending on the political climate, can be quite a lot as it is. So I would say there's probably an element of a weaker wine there, but a more social aspect of drinking it. You have to remember too, that wine wasn't just a thing that people drank to enjoy. Wine was the thing that people drank because it was safe. Alcohol kills bacteria. So where you might have something that would stay in still water for too long, or if a well went bad, wine would be something that you could always water down and still be safe to drink because the alcohol would kill any bacteria. So overall, I would say that some of the flavors would be stronger once they were concentrated from evaporation, but generally the alcohol would not be higher than it is today, or at least not significantly higher. And they would usually water it down, most people believe, to between 5 and 7%. So about as much as a beer or wine cooler, though probably not quite White Claw, if you will. Steph knew that one. Steph, thank you. I can tell you enjoy a good White Claw once in a while. Perfect. As long as you don't mix it with the wine. You've never had it? Never had it?
She doesn't like carbonated drinks.
Fair enough. I've heard of it. I've still never bought it in the grocery store. I just can't bring myself to do it. It feels like too much of a joke. So great. So excellent question, Bob and Steph. Thank you so much. Does anyone have anything else they would like to know before we move on to our Cabernet Sauvignon? And from there, afterwards, at the end of the session, I would invite you all, I'll open the floor to questions for everyone about any topic you'd like, whether it's one of the wines we drank today, or the wine or alcohol world at large. We can always cover tequila, we can talk about bourbon, we can talk about Scotch whiskey, anything you'd like to know. Or, even the inside outs of a restaurant. I'm happy to, spill the tea a little bit, as long as it's not in the restaurant. Wouldn't want to spill the tea, you know what I mean, on a guest. Great. So let's go with wine number 3, our Mount Veeder Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, this is the one I was looking forward to the most because I truly love Cabernet Sauvignon, but I also am very specific about where I buy it from. I love Napa Valley wines. I think they're truly great, and it's one of the regions I've been to the most. And a lot of sommeliers believe that North America just doesn't make wines of a quality with the old world. And so they'll kind of sneer when you say you've been to Napa again. But I think Napa is amazing. And I think there is beautiful fruit to be had there, and beautiful wines, but there's also some not so great ones. It's an unfortunate fact that there's a lot of wines of Napa that are just okay, but still command a really high price. But personally, for me, I don't know that I find $1,000 in any bottle of wine. I do like them. I just don't know that I'd want to pay that much for them. And I also don't know that I find a significant difference when I go from $250 to $500. So I don't know that they're always worth that high a price. But I also understand where that pricing comes from. If I was going to buy a ton of grapes and vinify them myself in my own backyard, let's say in Niagara, which is the closest one to me as I'm in Ontario, it would cost me about $500 to $600 for 1 ton of grapes. Let's say it's Pinot Noir. Now, if I was going to do the same thing in California, anywhere in California except for Napa, it would probably be around $2,000 for 1 ton of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes, because of course, Cabernet Sauvignon has a great cachet in California, and it's synonymous with high quality. It's like the king of reds. So you can't get around that you're going to pay a premium for that kind of wine. Now, in Napa Valley, the last time people were quoted on a price point for an average ton, we were looking between $8,500 and $9,000 for 1 ton of Cabernet Sauvignon. It naturally commands a higher price, and it has a lot to do with the Spurrier tasting of 1976. So here's a real wine history question of old. The Spurrier tasting is what put California on the map in terms of quality on a world scale. So Stephen Spurrier was a wine merchant in France who wanted to bring in North American wines and sell them in Paris. He was widely laughed at for, why would you want to do that? We've got all this wonderful Bordeaux, and everyone knows America doesn't make any good wine. So he rejected that claim. He went to Napa and he sought out what the best wines were across the region. He eventually decided to hold a tasting to put the new world against the old world, and the new world came out on top. Famously, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cask 73, or Cask 23, excuse me, came out on top with their 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon. And then for the Chardonnays, it was the Chateau Montelena that beat out some of the best wines out of Burgundy. So it was a pretty incredible victory. And because of that, people have started recognizing that if Bordeaux can price themselves this high and Napa Valley just beat them, then we can price ourselves even higher. And then some people started building up a pricing scheme for their tons of grapes that helped push it even further. So this is a good example of what happens at a very particular vineyard. It's probably considered to be the best vineyard in Napa. It's Tocolon. Tocolon is a much valued, much prized, very legendary, and at one point was owned by the Mondavis, but was then also sold to Constellation with the Mondavi name. So Constellation has been trying to prove that Tocolon is a brand and not a place, so that other people can't use the name. Anyway, some people like Tuck Beckstoffer and Andy Beckstoffer came up with a scheme of that if you're going to buy my Tocolon grapes, this is what the price is going to be. It's going to be $15,000 for 1 ton of Tocolon Cabernet Sauvignon. But you can only price your bottles at 1% of the total cost of the ton, which means that you can only charge $150 for 1 bottle. Now, if you want to charge, say, $200 because it was really hard to make and you did your best, well, then now that ton of grapes that you bought has retroactively increased in price to $20,000. So it's a pretty interesting way of driving the price up. And it's part of the reason that Napa's price keeps going up every year. whether it's earned or not. Now, I don't mean to denigrate Napa. I think Napa is truly beautiful, but I also recognize it is not all created equal. For instance, the center of the valley, the regions that we are most famously, that are probably most famous, are Oakville and Rutherford. And there are a lot of amazing vineyards in Oakville and Rutherford, but there are a lot of vineyards that are okay. And a lot of this has to do with the soil. Like as you get closer to the mountains, the Mayakama range, you get better exposure to the sun, you get better drainage, and overall you're producing a better, more refined Cabernet Sauvignon. But when you have your vineyards just on the valley floor, well, then you've got a lot of access to water, you've got a lot of access to alluvial soil and a lot of nutrients, which means your grapes try to produce more green growth than they do quality grapes. And that can mean that while you will ripen the grapes that you do have, they will not necessarily be the most interesting. And so that's where I think the biggest divide is. People have started to recognize that not all parts of Napa are created equal, and they've begun to separate themselves on this basis. A really good example of this is Stag's Leap, because the Stag's Leap district is actually like one district that's split in half, and the Stag's Leap area of it has a lot of short foothills that are perfect for planting on, that create the drainage and simulate what you get on the Mayakama side with the exposure from the mountains and planting on that. Oh man, that east-facing exposure. So sorry, these wines are so good. I'm not drunk, I promise. Great. So one of the ways that we can naturally get around this problem with the valleys is actually not to get wine from the valley section of Napa. There are some wonderful mountain sections that have only just been started to be investigated, and they're truly remarkable. So here's where my Canadian nature comes in. I'm going to refer to meters in Celsius now. Every 100 meters you go up in elevation, you lose 1 degree Celsius of the overall temperature of the area. So that is a pretty significant thing. So if you plant at 800 meters, what would normally be a warm or moderate climate can automatically become a cool climate, which means that you can restrain the alcohol, you can keep your acidity, and you can build a more interesting wine that has a longer ripening period to create all the elements that are going to make it so much more interesting. And that is what we're seeing with our Mount Veeder Cabernet Sauvignon. What a beautiful segue that guy did. Excellent. So let's go ahead and smell this and see what we can pull out of the signature grape of Napa Valley. Great. What do we think, Kerry Hovey and Co.? What do you guys think about the Gerard Mount Veeder Cab? Oh, you look like you're just pouring it. I'm so sorry. I'll let you let that decant a little bit more. It definitely needs to breathe. It's quite a big wine. So let's go back to Julian Scott. Julian Scott, what do you think?
Interesting. When I first was smelling it, it was almost like a coconut
Yes.
scent in there. Then definitely some vanilla as well.
So that's excellent. Very good calls. And what we've heard is the presence of new oak on the wine. Both of those chemicals are lactones. Lactones are found in new oak. And those lactones are vanillins, respectively, of course, creating the term vanilla. And then, of course, we have the whiskey lactone, most famous for creating the smell of coconut. So Julian Scott hit it right on the nose. You picked out the new oak right away. Now, let's see what's underneath the wood. Because at the same time that it's there, I get a pretty cool note. Does anyone get anything that is a little bit minty or green or eucalyptal on this wine? I have a pretty strong note of eucalyptus hitting me right in the face right now. And it's under a lot of black fruit, but it's there and it is great. It creates a beautiful effervescence to a wine that would otherwise be very dense and rich. So does anyone else get that note? Maybe think of it as like green or even spearmint or camphor, but it is there. So great. So let's talk about where that is from. Now, I talked about the life cycle of the bunch of grapes on the vine already at the beginning. I talked about that green bunch of grapes being relatively uninteresting and designed to be, or rather, by evolution, so green that it keeps away predators from eating the grapes prematurely. So that way they have time to build up acidity, sugar, flavor, all the things that make them interesting. However, there are some grapes that do not lose the green character, and Cabernet Sauvignon is in that family. So the family of grapes of Cabernet Sauvignon is this. We've got Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc, who came together and created Cabernet Sauvignon. They are the parents of it. Cabernet Sauvignon then is cousin to Merlot, Carmenere and Malbec to a lesser degree. But all of those grapes have this signature character. This green note that we're detecting is called pyrazines or methoxylpyrazines or whatever you'd like to call it. But pyrazines are generally leftovers from this underripe period. Normally, pyrazines are there, like I said, to reduce predators from getting the grapes. And then as it begins to ripen, they leave, and you get this beautiful expression that we saw in the last two wines. But here in this family of grapes, they retain it even to full ripeness. But it does change a little bit when we get there. If you have a very underripe Cabernet Sauvignon, you might find it to smell like chili peppers or jalapenos or even like red pepper. But in this case, I find it's evolved really well. It's ripened alongside the grape and has developed into a camphor character, which is a signature of mountain fruit in Napa Valley. Whenever you've got Cabernet Sauvignon in the mountain areas, you always retain a little bit of this green note, but you also get it evolved into something much more pleasant. The green note of pyrazines is something that we are on an evolutionary level kind of designed to be not interested in. We recognize it as something that is underripe, something that is not ready to be eaten. So for some people, when there's a very strong presence of pyrazines, they do not like the wine. It can be very polarizing. A great example is Carmenere, which from Chile has a huge amount of pyrazines and it's so aggressive that it puts people off. They can't even get to the fruit underneath. But Cabernet Sauvignon has a really great balance of having wonderful fruit expression and having just the right amount of pyrazines that it creates a more complex flavor without turning people away from the wine. So I think truly remarkable expression of it. I think so far the notes that we've gotten have been great. I love coconut, I love vanilla, and I would say both of those are there. I almost get, and this is very specific to my French Canadian upbringing, but French toast is fully here as well, but primarily the spices that go alongside it: cinnamon, a little bit of nutmeg, a touch of clove, going all alongside that minty green character. And all underneath that is this wonderful expression of red fruit and black fruit. I get a lot of blackberry, I get a lot of black currant, I get a really tight bounty of like blackberry and blueberry jam. It's really expressive on the nose and very, very concentrated. It suggests to me that when we're talking about wines that are going to age, this is the one that's going to age the best because it has the highest density of that character. Now let's taste it and see if it has the other things we need to age. If it's got acidity and tannins. That is great, and that is chewy and chunky. Just the way that I described the tannins earlier for Cabernet Sauvignon are presenting themselves here. First off, I get a huge hit of dryness right on the top of my tongue, and I feel it in my gums, in my cheeks, everywhere. It is chunky and coarse, classic Cabernet Sauvignon tannins. But more than that, I also get a wonderful expression following it of acidity where my mouth is watering and I can feel it sliding down underneath my tongue right on either side. So truly wonderful. We have great tannins here. We have great acidity. And based on how chewy that fruit remains in the palate, actually leaning a little bit more underripe on the palate than it is on the nose, this says to me that this is a wine that's going to unpack incredibly well. And I would say this has at least 20 years on it to show its full potential. So with that, that is Napa Valley. That is Cabernet Sauvignon. And unfortunately, I have some bad news for you, not for any people that love Cab in general, but for Napa Valley. 2020 was referred to as the lost year last year, the lost vintage, because there was so much smoke taint from the fire that happened right in the middle of Napa that a lot of the wines that are there are completely untenable. And it's very insidious. It's worth knowing how this works. The creosote that's created from the smoke of the burning, the fire taking place, lands on the skin of the grapes, and it binds with the proteins that are in the skin. Now, sometimes those proteins unbind really quickly when it's fermented, and you get that really strong campfire smell, incredibly aggressive, undrinkable wine. But sometimes those proteins bind and then rest for sometimes a couple of years. It's been found from wines that were exposed to smoke from the 27, or rather grapes that were exposed to smoke from the 2017 fires, that while they did not initially show a strong campfire note, in 2 to 3 years, those proteins unbound, and when they opened the bottle, it was completely campfire smoked up. So it's very insidious the way this particular issue affects these wines and these grapes, to the point that some of our own winemakers at VWE could not find a lot of grapes in Napa Valley to actually purchase in the last year to produce some of their signature blends, especially Cameron Hughes. So very interesting, very bad, and hopefully more fire control and more ways of tackling this will be put in place in the future to try and stop this from happening again. Napa, of course, accounts for 25% of the entire revenue for the wine industry of California, even though it is only 4% of the land. So that being said, I don't want to say that everything is doom and gloom. Napa has been, if anything, getting better and better with its winemaking. So there's a lot of promise here, even in times where things are certainly changing, maybe for the worse. But I think Napa is going to continue to get better. There are some winemakers that are pursuing more restrained wines, also reducing their levels of alcohol. And when we used to see 15%, 16% jam bombs coming out of the region that didn't have a lot of character, now we're seeing 14, 14.5 that are restrained and still really bound with deep depths of fruit. So I would say the future looks really bright for really high quality expressions of grapes from the Napa Valley. Great. So those are our 3 wines today. I have some news for you. I am the head sommelier for the Sommelier Company, and we have a shop. It is shop.sommeliercompany.com. I'm going to throw it into the chat window for you so you can see it. And this is where we sell some of our packs for our virtual tastings. Now, this one was custom for you, but we have a lot that are very successful for us, and we've rated them a couple ways. We have our wines of the Pacific, we have our wines of California, and we have premium expressions of both, as well as some interesting blends and forgotten indigenous varietals, all curated by myself. And they are, I think, wonderful packages to get. If you liked any of the wines from some of those packages, some of them you can buy individually, and we expect to expand this over the future. You as VWE shareholders do get a 15% discount on all the wines that you see there. So if any of those packs do seem exciting to you, you can always reach out and grab them there. Further to that, if you have more questions about what our virtual tastings are like, you have had a firsthand experience, and I've got to say, you've been a wonderful audience, so thank you so much. You can always reach me at chris@sommeliercompany.com, which I'm throwing into the chat window right now, if you have more questions or would like to host a tasting yourself. We're always available. We have a wonderful sommelier team of over 300 people throughout North America, so whether it's in person or virtual, we can accommodate any situation and your custom selections of wines. Even if they are outside the VWE portfolio, we do still work with those as well, and we can try and figure out what the best one is for your tasting. We also do bourbon, tequila, scotch, and anything that can get you tipsy, we can tell you about. So with that, that is generally the end of the presentation, but I am with you for an hour and a half. So if anyone has any questions, I will take anything that you have, whether you'd like to know more about VWE or the Sommelier Company, or wine or whiskey or restaurants in general.
So I'll ask about VWE. Are there different, are there vineyards from the VWE family that you're familiar with? I mean, we're familiar with Clopagast, been members for a long time. These have all been very interesting wines within the VWE family. Are there other wineries underneath the family that you're familiar with, Chris?
Yes, there are a couple. Well, first off, Gerard is one that I'm fairly well versed in. It's always been one of my go-tos for purchasing when I'm in a restaurant. I find it to be a wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon that is exemplary of what makes of what is good about Napa Valley, as well as not commanding too high a price point that it is out of the reach of the average consumer. And that's one of the things I love about it. So I think that's a great one to look at. Also, I'm a huge fan of Clopagast, so it's pretty hard to get away from that. I always love how well restrained their Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are. And I would say the Mitsuko's Vineyard Chardonnay is maybe the best one I've had out of California in a very long time, at least within the VWE brand. I don't know that I would say anything beats Kistler, but we don't own them, so we can't say it. So that's a whole other thing. I am also based out of Canada, so while I have had a chance to visit a lot of the wineries in Napa Valley that I enjoy, and some in Sonoma, I am yet to make the trip out and visit some of our wineries directly. So I'm looking forward to actually going to see BR Cone. And while they are not close by, I intend to go to Tamarack Cellars as well. I think Tamarack Cellars in Washington is some of the best quality product that we make. And I think Washington is critically underrated. So I always try to give them a boost whenever I can. Coupe, of course, which we've tasted today, is one of the Syrahs I find is showcasing how well that grape does in the New World. And I hope to see more expressions of it. I think Australia has for a very long time run the market on Shiraz, maybe to its detriment. While there are some really great Shirazes in Australia, I don't think any of them have the elegance that this particular one does. So something to explore and continue to look at. I also think that if I was going to go and visit a winery to go and learn a little bit more for myself, because as a sommelier, we're always hungry. We can't stop learning things. I would probably go to Laticia, if not for anything else except to learn more about the different clones they have. I'm relatively familiar with clone 667 because it's quite popular in the New World for producing a darker skinned grape, but I'd like to see more of what they have and also understand a little bit more of the soil composition of their vineyards. I love when people select specific blocks of vineyards that they have because they're quite cool. And while soil composition is often misunderstood, it's still worth looking at because it tells you a lot about how the soil drains and what kind of nutrients there is. Now, I didn't go off on this diatribe before, but now it seems like a good time since I brought it up. Minerality in wine is something that a lot of sommeliers and winemakers will talk about without fully understanding what they're saying or the limitations of it. So it is not possible physically or chemically for a grapevine to break down rocks and minerals in a soil to such a degree that they would then be absorbed through the root system, up through the grapevine and into the grapes in any meaningful way that would then augment the flavor. It's not possible, can't be done. But, you know, if you talk to a French winemaker in Burgundy, he'll say, you know, look at the vineyard here, look at the vineyard here. If you see it's clay in the soil, this wine tastes like clay. And over here, it's limestone. You cannot say that it's not a terroir. But what they're missing there is that it's not physically possible. And also, clay and limestone don't have flavor. So at the same time that you can say they taste like it, I don't know what they mean. I was once, when I first started off in this industry, a very, what's a good way to put it? Eager sommelier. And some friends of mine and I decided, what if we did like a rock tasting to better understand the soil? What we learned from that is that rock tastings are unnecessary and gross because they don't taste like anything. So now that I've done that, you don't have to. The thing about rocks is that they don't have ions or any chemicals to exchange to create the flavor that we recognize when we're interacting with it on the palate or even on the nose. There's nothing coming off of them that's creating scent unless they're wet. But it's not the stone that's making the character, it's actually bacteria within it. So let's say, picture if you will, I'm going to take you on a bit of a trip. Imagine that you are just walking out of your house, going to the car, it's just started to rain, and the rain is hitting the concrete and the cement of the sidewalk or what have you. And you can smell the sidewalk in the air. You can smell the concrete. Well, knowing that concrete doesn't have a smell, it's got to be something else. And what people identified in the 1960s was a tone called Petrichor. Petrichor is the name given to bacteria that lives in the soil, or at least the way that it smells, because each different kind of soil has a different kind of shape to the bacteria that lives within it. And so they have different smells. So what our best guess is of where minerality comes from in a wine is it's either coming from bacteria that could make its way up into the grape, or it could be, you know, a little bit of, you know, dust from the soil making its way on the grape. But once again, it doesn't have a flavor. So it has to be bacteria in some way or another. But yeah, that is our best guess about minerality. So at the same time that I love looking at soil composition, I've frustrated my wife so much by taking too many pictures of dirt when I've gone on vacation. So I have to try and explain that it's actually about the drainage and it's actually about how deep the roots go, and seeing the composition can tell you what they can do. So that's my diatribe about minerality. Thank you so much for coming to my TED Talk. I will get off my soapbox now and you can continue asking questions. Wonderful. So did anyone have a favorite of the three wines that we had so far? Did anyone learn something new about these grapes?
I have a question.
Oh, yes, please, Steph.
So one, I'll put a plug in for BR Cone. We've been members there for like 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Really good. But my question is, with things like wildfires and environmental changes out in California, are there other regions that you're looking to for wine production, like that you're looking at? Like, I mean, we make a lot of, you know, Pacific Northwest wines and other,
Yes.
you know, places.
Northern Michigan, for example, which is
Oh, yeah.
the place we go.
Yeah, the Constantine Vineyards in Northern Michigan are truly remarkable and have a great history there. So yeah, Northern Michigan's a great spot. I have to plug Washington again, because while there are still fires in the Pacific Northwest and Washington does get affected, I think that they will be a really big region for producing high quality Cabernet Sauvignon because very slowly Cabernet Sauvignon has supplanted Merlot as the most planted grape, and it does really well in that climate. Like they proved that Merlot can grow there, and it's only a matter of time before it warms up enough that Cabernet Sauvignon can also do amazing things in that soil. And I would say it's already happening. Some amazing vineyards out there aside from Tamarack Cellars. You could look to Charles Smith, you could look at Kay's Vineyards. All of those are producing really high quality expressions. So Washington's always a good choice. I would even say New York and the Finger Lakes is producing some really great and convincing cool climate expressions of Riesling. So I believe it's only a matter of time before Chardonnay and Pinot Noir follow, which means we're going to have some really elegant expressions coming from that region. Also, this is kind of a funny one, but I went there for my certified exam when I went to become a sommelier, Texas, and specifically Texas Sangiovese. So it's a little bit weird. There are 4,000 indigenous varietals in Italy, but we mostly talk about 16 different varietals that have traveled around the globe, and most of those are French. We don't really think about a lot of Italian wines in other places aside from Italy, even though everything that we're drinking today comes from France, so why not Italy? What's great about wines from Italy is that generally, because it's a little bit more Mediterranean than France is and not quite so warm as Spain, the grapes that grow there do really well in a warm climate. So places like Texas, places like California, places like Australia have now really come into the mindset of, hey, you know, maybe we should be doing this too. And so we're starting to see Sangiovese, Nero d'Avola, Primitivo, which is Zinfandel, even though California does not like to admit it, and all these other grapes that handle warm climates really well, coming to some of the hotter regions around the world. And it's like I said with Garnacha and some of the grapes that do really well in the south of Rhone, all these grapes retain acidity and they lengthen and they ripen for a very long period of time, which makes them ideal for warm climates where other grapes would otherwise over ripen. So I think that those regions are going to be very promising in the future too, as long as they don't go too far with all this bourbon barrel aging nonsense. I love bourbon, but let's keep bourbon in those barrels and let's not put wine in them. Oh, Steph, you were muted.
Oh, sorry. Are they growing anything in Canada?
Oh, yes, we are. Absolutely, yes. First off, we've retired our mousses and hockey sticks in favor of planting high quality grape expressions. In Niagara, we are working really diligently to produce high quality examples of Riesling, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. I think that's what we do best, but it's become warm enough here that we're now producing Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot, and also Petit Verdot, some Malbec. I personally think that Malbec, Petit Verdot, and Cabernet Sauvignon are a little ambitious for our climate. It still gets incredibly cold in some areas. And when it gets cold enough here, once it hits minus 28, the vines can actually shatter because the sap inside them freezes and the vines burst, which has happened. We actually have to bury some of our vines in the cooler areas of Canada to preserve them from this happening. But I would say that our Pinot Noir is truly incredible, and it's a very strong facsimile of Burgundy because we have a similar, our climate is similar enough to Burgundy that the acidity is very similar as well. And because it's so cold, it's got a similar ripening climate too. I would say that at the same time that I love Sonoma, I think Niagara is closer to Burgundy in terms of relative quality than Sonoma is. Sonoma declares itself in some cases as a cool climate, but that is only in the most general terms, and only like one region of Russian River Valley, Green Valley of Russian River Valley is truly a cool climate, maybe. So got to say Niagara. In British Columbia, they produce some really great wines out of the Columbia Valley because the Columbia Valley extends up and just crosses the border into British Columbia. And then also in the Okanagan Valley, which is actually warming up significantly since climate change, there are some really great expressions of Merlot, of Cabernet Sauvignon, and one of the best ones is called Checkmate. I actually wonder if I have the bottle on me here. No, I don't. So this one called Checkmate, they kind of banked on the idea that climate change was coming. So they planted it in an area that would not be able to ripen Merlot at the time they planted. But knowing that the vines were going to take 5 years to reach maturity, by the time that happened, they were ready and they made some incredible Chardonnay and some incredible Merlot, all of which is fermented using natural yeast and no new barrels. So you only get the expression of the pure grape and it's exquisite. One of the best Chardonnays I've ever had, period, from around the world. Then maybe one last region to go and explore is Nova Scotia. So on the east coast of Canada, where they were previously only using French hybrid grapes like Cheval Blanc and L'Acadie Blanc, which are kind of hot garbage is a good way to put it. Hot garbage. Yeah, that's accurate. Now they've started planting Chardonnay and Pinot Noir because once again, it's getting warm enough that they can actually grow them really well there. So now the industry is probably about to take off. And I bet similar to the UK, they're going to be producing really high quality expressions of sparkling wine. It's only a matter of time that it's still very cold for producing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but using them in a sparkling traditional method wine is going to give Chardonnay, is going to give Champagne in the UK probably a run for their money. So I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. It's nice to think of my own home province as doing so well by wine. So off the top of my head, in North America, those are the places I would suggest going to get some cool stuff in the near future or now. Wonderful. Another thing to touch on, which is relevant to wine because it is in the hospitality industry, is the recent hiring issues that a lot of restaurants have been having. It is likely that this trend is going to continue, so prices in restaurants are probably going to increase. Usually that means the alcohol is going to be marked up further. The alcohol itself is already getting more expensive because of the supply line issues with actually getting glass bottles, which have to be coal-fired or heated in such a way that they are sturdy enough to hold wine and not shatter so easily. So it is likely that restaurants are going to continue to get more expensive. So hopefully that will translate to sessions like this, virtual tastings and in-person tastings where a sommelier comes to your home will become more popular because we will not mark up the wine on you, at least not that much. And then also you're paying for the tasting, not for that anyway. It's a wonderful, intimate experience where you get to talk to a sommelier who is, again, not trying to sell you a second more expensive bottle of wine. And it's a truly great I would say that I don't have a better time than when I'm answering questions for people that want to know about wine. I think it's the funnest part of my job, and it's a thing that I truly love to do. I hope that is expressed in how I do with these tastings because I feel like I get very enthusiastic about it, and sometimes I have to restrain myself from going too far off the deep end into a cul-de-sac of information that may not be relevant. So that is my take on that. Does anyone else have any questions about anything that we covered today or anything that you'd like to know about wine? Everyone looks pretty happy there. We still haven't covered what our favorite was. What would you guys say? Let's go by showing of hands. If you liked 1, if you liked 2, if you liked 3, who's got a favorite? Which one was it?
Gerard.
I got season 1, 2, 3. Man, it's all over the place. Cool. 1 and 3, 3, 2. Wonderful. What a great variety we've got here. So it looks like we have something for everybody, which I got to say is pretty good for us. So that's really cool. I think all of these wines are really good. I don't know that I have a favorite because I think when you get really deep into wine, especially when you do it for a job, you stop seeing wines as objectively better than the other ones. You start seeing them as for particular purposes. Like because I've had to pair wines with things like, ice creamed eel, which, by the way, not easy. And the answer to that question is what pairs with that? It's Northern Italian Pinot Grigio Rosé. It's the only one that I could find to work with that. Anyway, but we've also had to pair with like bison, and we've had to pair with things like traditional risottos with white truffle. And so when I look at wines like this, the first things that I think about are where do these fit in menus like that? What goes with them best? And what is the purpose for them? So that way, it never allows me to like pick one over another, at least not objectively, because they're so different. But it allows me to keep them in their corners and compare them to other wineries within those regions. Like I would compare the Mount Veeder Cabernet Sauvignon to other cabs from Napa, but even then, I'd probably still only compare it to other mountain region cabs because it's so different from the valley. And it makes a huge difference in how you approach it as well.
So you open the door, what would you pair with each of these?
Interesting. Okay, great. So starting off with our Laticia, it's got a beautiful bounty of fruit. It is not overripe, it's relatively restrained, and it's got a great dark color to it. I want to say duck. I think duck is my first instinct on this one. And I think a good quality duck with a really good jus, like a balsamic jus around the edge, is going to be the way to go. Maybe with a touch of cinnamon. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but putting that alongside the sauce really does bring them up a little bit, and it helps if there's any barrel influence. There's not a lot here, but I think it'll help unwind some of the darker fruit. So I think that's what I would do with that one. Duck almost for sure. If I was going to go with the Syrah, man, that's a little bit tougher, but I still think, you know, it smells like a charcuterie board. Let's put it with a charcuterie board. This is the perfect thing to go alongside brisket, to go alongside some cured meats. I would even say with some Iberico ham, this could run a pretty nice pairing alongside of it. Let's go with Iberico A5 ham, which is, you know, the highest content of they're pigs that have to eat hazelnuts to make sure they maintain a particular flavor. It's truly amazing. So, you know, a nice leg of jamon from Iberico to go alongside the Syrah. And then with our, with our Napa Cab, with our big boy. So it's really dense. It's really compoted, but it has remarkable structure. And I think that's what it has best going for it. It's really hard to pair fruit things with other, like fruit flavors with other flavors on a dish, because you're never going to have like a steak or a ribeye that tastes like blackberries. But it is much easier to think about the structure and how well it's going to balance out, and then to see how the fruit goes with the sauces on the dish. So I think I'd want to put this, because it does have restraint, with a strip loin. And here's why. I think that this would overpower a tenderloin. It has too much influence of new oak to match alongside of it. And because a strip loin does have a wonderful fat cap along the outside of it, it's got a lot of rich character that's going to make a natural pairing to go alongside richer sauces, which will then in turn go alongside this. Something with the strong peppercorn sauce might be a good way to go. I know we didn't talk about peppers on this, and I don't really find peppercorn to be a note of this particular Cabernet Sauvignon, but it is distinct, and it does stand out to pair with black olive notes, and also to create a counterpoint to the eucalyptol and camphor that I get on the nose. So that's my best guess. Strip loin particularly, to put alongside this with a strong, rich sauce. I would also suggest mushrooms, but that's just because I like mushrooms. Wonderful. I'm very envious of Carrie and Co. for, it looks like they made short work of that charcuterie board. Really, really well done, guys. So Carrie and Co., we haven't had a chance to hear from you because you guys have been very occupied with that board. You can see you did a really good job on it. So what do you guys think of the wines that we've had today? We've already heard about favorites. I think we said number 3. But what did you catch that was new, or what was different for you? What did you learn on this one? What's your experience? I'd love to hear. You are currently muted, but there we go.
We unmuted, so I'm going to let the boys answer.
Okay, certainly. I don't know who's Carrie, so I just said Carrie and Co. I felt it was the best.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Carrie did do the charcuterie board, and it was much appreciated and very tasty.
Well done, Carrie. You made me very hungry.
Yeah. No, the wines were fantastic. We've been really falling into the Pinot Noir. Still really love cabs.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since I've had a Shiraz, but I thought the Shiraz was fantastic.
Yeah, it's such a different expression of Syrah or Shiraz than I'm used to in the New World, that it really catches me. It's just an amazing bounty of outside fruit flavors that you don't get usually in the New World. Like I like Shiraz from Australia, but with a specific purpose, because I want a big jam bomb when I go for one of those. This is a really nice restrained expression that, oh man, it just gets better and better. And the pepper, I feel like the pepper comes out more the longer it sits in the glass. So really, really fun. Can't wait to drink these tonight. Not all of them, some of them.
It was just really, all of them gave just kind of a full flavor. They typically you'd see a pretty big range, but I didn't think they were that vast of a difference, or as a full flavor as it sat in your mouth. Sure.
Between all three, you didn't find them to be a big difference?
Not for me. It wasn't a huge difference. And some, when I've had some become so light, it's almost like, am I really drinking wine?
True. Yeah, that's very true.
These were all very, very flavorful and full. I enjoyed all 3.
Yeah, yeah.
My favorite.
Oh, I think that's great. You know, honestly, when I drank the Pinot Noir, I was surprised that it wasn't lighter, because I usually expect Pinot Noir, especially from cooler regions, to be a little bit light. But this was really amazing. I thought it was really dense and chewy, and still maintained what's so great about Pinot Noir, which has got beautiful acidity, not too high tannins, and a great note of woodsy character on the back end. So it was truly a great way to express it. So, I think I know what you're all wondering now, and it's what to do with all these wines if you've got any left over. And I'm looking at you, Wayne, because I see that it looks like you're alone at the moment with your 3 bottles. So you're probably wondering what to do with all these. Well, here's the answer. I would say first drink them in order. I ordered them in such a way that they make a logical progression of what to finish first and then what to drink last. Because of course, Pinot Noir has the least of the qualities that we need to stop a wine from aging, which is to say tannins, because tannins reduce micro-oxidation. And wine is always trying to be vinegar. It always wants to become vinegar. It allows a lot of acidic bacteria to come in. It eats the alcohol, and that's what turns into vinegar. Of course, we would not have vinegar without wine. I mean, that's what creates the vin in vinegar. Knowing that, the Pinot Noir is the first one to drink before it goes off. Secondly, you'd want to go with the Syrah, because the Syrah does have a level of tannins to it, so it will last a little bit longer. And then lastly, the Cabernet Sauvignon has got the most legs to keep it going, so that'll be the one that you can finish last if you don't finish them all tonight. I'm sure you all could, but I don't want to put any pressure on. So with that, some other ways to keep them in good shape. Of course, Wayne does have a Coravin, so he's got a leg up on making sure that those are going to stay nice and fresh. If you don't have a Coravin and you cannot finish them, what I usually recommend is having a pump. If you've got a pump cork, where you can put the cork in the top and pump the air out, that always helps get you an extra day or two. And then lastly, if you really can't finish it, pour out as much as you think you can drink tonight, and then pour the rest into a mason jar up to the top. The mason jar doesn't allow, if you get it completely full, it doesn't allow any oxygen transfer or oxygen exchange. So it actually keeps the wine fairly fresh. So it's one of my best recommendations on how to preserve that wine if you don't have a lot of friends handy to help you finish it off. So that is my idea on that one. So thank you so much, everybody. We're coming pretty much to a close of the tasting. Does anyone have any last questions before we do?
Oh, geez.
Does anyone want to comment on my Canadian accent? I think it is still pronounced. So we can always, if anyone would like to make any jokes about moose, you're welcome to, or hockey.
I was going to ask one last thing, Chris. I don't think you're that Canadian. It's sensible, but more almost Minnesotan,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But what you talked about the charcuterie that Carrie and company had. What's your favorite cheese to just pair in general with wine?
Oh man, that's a tough
With red
one.
wine. Let's just choose
Top
one.
three.
Like,
Top three. We'll give you top.
Sure. Okay, top cheeses. I'm going to say Brie right off the bat. Brie is the easiest one to pair, and it's also one of the most delightful. Brie comes from the Burgundy region. Of course, Burgundy and Pinot Noir come from the Burgundy region. They make a very natural pairing, and it's because in the old world, there's such a long history of wine being served at the dinner table that the cheese and the wine have kind of grown up together. In some cases, they've grown up to augment each other and balance each other at the dinner table. So in that way, I'd say Pinot Noir is a natural selection to go alongside Brie. And because there is so much good quality Pinot Noir out there, it makes for a very fun pairing to see how they interact. Now, secondly, I think my favorite one to go with, or just to have on its own, is Compte Azura. So that's from the Jura region of France. It's an alpine region, and it's very aromatic. It's sort of like a softer Parmesan with not quite as salty a character. It's really great when it's aged a little bit. And I think one of my favorite things to go alongside that is champagne. And that also is great for me because I love champagne. So having champagnes that have kind of a more bright character to them, or even a richer character like Bollinger is a really great way to pass alongside it, or Ruinart. Ruinart was a wine that previously was not available in the Canadian market, so I had to go to the United States to get it. And I gotta say, truly remarkable champagne, great one to go alongside Compte Azura. Another one that I really enjoy as far as cheeses go, man, what's a great one here? I guess I'd have to say Manchego. Manchego is a really, really great cheese. And I was lucky enough to have my honeymoon in Rioja. So I went to Portugal, went through there and went to Rioja region. And it was a remarkable experience. There's Manchego everywhere. There's jamon everywhere. And I find, again, Manchego is one that naturally pairs really well with Tempranillo-based wines like Rioja. But I would also say there's room for that to go alongside Bordeaux. There's room for that to go alongside some Cabernet Sauvignon from the Napa Valley, if it's from a cooler region like the mountains. It's a really dense cheese that has a sharp flavor, and things with a lot of wines with a lot of notes like the camphor that we got off the Cabernet Sauvignon will match with it really well. So those are my best suggestions for cheeses to go alongside those. So with that, I think we've generally come to the end of the tasting, unless anyone's got a last question. Oh, looks like we're pretty good. So I gotta say thank you so much for your attention, everyone. This is my favorite thing to do. And I will leave you with this idea. I know the wine world can be a little bit dense sometimes. It is the reason that I have a job, because sometimes it is so inscrutable. And sometimes you're just trying to buy something fun at the liquor store and you're walking through and it's like you're walking through the Louvre and all the portraits are turned to face the wall. So ideally, sessions like this give you an idea of which portraits are worth turning around. And with that, please drink responsibly, or don't, because I'm not your boss.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Chris.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you so much.
Cheers.